Where does Patrick Mahomes rank among the greatest quarterbacks of all time? What's going on, football fans? It's Mitch here to break down and debate the status of Patrick Mahomes as an all-time great NFL quarterback. Is he top 10, top 5, top 3 of all time? Is he the greatest quarterback to ever live? There is a vocal minority that might suggest that already. There is no debate that Patrick Mahomes has had the greatest 6-year start to an NFL career. 3 Super Bowl championships, 4 Super Bowl appearances. The young man has never missed the AFC Championship game. That's pretty impressive. He has 2 MVPs. He's the best quarterback right now. But is he the best of all time? And where does he rank right now among the greatest of all time? And that's what this video is about. We're going to look at 10 plus all-time great quarterbacks, stack up the resumes. Mahomes versus all-time great. And we will determine via a tier list where Patrick Mahomes belongs after 2023 and the 2024 Super Bowl, his 3rd Super Bowl ring, back-to-back. Gronk, spike the like button. If you're a Chiefs Kingdom fan, maybe you want a Kelsey spike it. Let's swiftly get into the content. Let me know in the comment section below where you believe Patrick Mahomes belongs among the greatest quarterbacks of all time. Play along if you want. Let me know who you think he's better than in this video, who you think he's worse than. If you think he's the greatest of all time, leave your debate. Of course, we're looking at his resume so far through his first 6 seasons as a starter in the NFL. We have no clue what's going to be ahead for his future. We don't know how long he's going to play. We don't know how many more Super Bowl rings he'll have. We don't know how many more MVPs he will put on his trophy shelf. We do not know. But what we know is what we know now. And just like the greats before, Montana, Unitas, Brady, Manning, Rodgers, we always compare them to the greats, and we see where they stack up while their career is going on. So that's the fun I want to have in this video. Let's get to it. So how we're going to do this, we've got ourselves a tier list. This tier list is as follows. There is tier number 1, which is stop it. Mahomes is nowhere close to this tier. He's not the greatest of all time. He's not even close. Tier number 2 is these players are better than Mahomes, and I'm pretty much certain they are better than Mahomes from a legacy standpoint, an accomplishment standpoint, and a career standpoint. It's debatable, meaning maybe Mahomes is better, but maybe not. Little debate means that Mahomes is almost certainly better, but there's maybe something about that player that makes you believe that maybe that player has an edge on Mahomes in a couple different categories of legacy. Mahomes is better, meaning, yeah, he's better, period. No question. And the final tier is Mahomes clears, meaning, yeah, don't even have to think about it. It's like 1-second discussion. Mahomes is better than this player. So taking a look at Mahomes' career so far through his first 6 seasons, which is extremely impressive that he's accomplished all this through his young career, and we don't know what else he'll accomplish. But so far, after the 2023-2024 NFL season, this is as Patrick Mahomes looks. 3 Super Bowl rings, 4 Super Bowl appearances, 89 wins, 2 MVPs, 3-time yard or touchdown leader, combined, and 3 All-Pro teams, All-Pro Team 1, All-Pro second team, 3. So, those are the categories at a basic level that we can discuss the greatest quarterbacks to ever live. When people discuss the greatest quarterbacks of all time and they rank them in the top 10, these are the categories that come up most frequently. There's more nuance to these discussions, which I hope to add when we're talking about the greatest quarterbacks of all time in this video. I'll try to add that layer upon the player versus Mahomes and the discussion. And I want to hear from you guys if I miss anything or you think there's a specific thing I should mention about player X versus Mahomes. Let me know in the comment section below, and let's waste no more time. I want to begin with one of the most controversial quarterbacks in NFL history when it comes to ranking. Because there's some people that would say that Dan Marino was the greatest player to ever live. He was the most accurate. He was deadly in the pocket. He had the fastest release. He had one of the greatest arms. He was one of the most accurate. He had one of the greatest seasons in 1984. He was, just like Mahomes, amazing early in his career. But he never won a Super Bowl ring, despite all the yards, all the touchdowns, the career accolades that he accomplished, which makes Dan Marino extremely hard to rank and extremely hard to compare to somebody like Patrick Mahomes, who's still young in their career, but has more rings by far and team success. So let's take a look at Marino and what he accomplished in his career. Dan Marino, obviously 0 Super Bowl rings. He did make it to 1 Super Bowl in his second season. Very similar to Mahomes, was very good early on. Had Don Shula for some of his young career and was an absolute phenom. As a passer, I think few would argue that Dan Marino was one of the greatest of all time. And I think that he is one of the quarterbacks that is constantly brought up when it comes to which quarterback would have been the most successful in today's era because of the All-Pro teams. 8 that he made his way onto. 8 All-Pro teams. And the crazy thing is, he only won 1 MVP despite being on 8 All-Pro teams, which is absolutely insane. I don't really understand it. I don't know what they're voting there. 6-time yard or touchdown leader, which is an extremely impressive number. But yet, no Super Bowl rings. No team success. Very little playoff success. Very little clutch success. So how does that compare to somebody like Patrick Mahomes, who has 3 Super Bowl rings? He might have less, all-time seasons in terms of 5 less All-Pro teams. Not nearly the amount of yard or touchdown leader per season accomplishments. He does have 1 more MVP despite playing way less years in the NFL. So overall, I would argue that as potent as Marino was in his career, when it's all said and done, right now, I think you would have to argue that Patrick Mahomes is probably ranking higher on all-time lists simply because he has the 3 rings that Marino never got his hands on. And I understand that some people think that quarterback wins are not a stat. I think that winning is the most important thing that an athlete could ever do in any sport because that's why we play the game. And when it came to a certain individual at the quarterback position, people did not give him that credit. But in every other regard, we give that credit. So I have Dan Marino in the little debate category. I think there is a tiny bit of a debate because Marino was one of the most accurate, best passers. I think as a pure passer, Marino is better than Mahomes. I think as an athlete, Mahomes is better than Marino. I think in terms of accomplishments, Marino's obviously done more in terms of statistical, but I think you can look at Mahomes and say he's done more in terms of team success. And then I think Mahomes, not trying to project overall, but down the road, he'll certainly pick up his fair share of individual accolades. So I think you've got to put him in the little debate category. Moving on to a player that's very similar to Marino, maybe less acclaimed for his individual talent and more acclaimed because he played recently and had very similar accolades, career accolades, individual accomplishments, records, passing stats. just an absolute potent passer, and that is Drew Brees of the New Orleans Saints and San Diego Chargers at one time. Drew Brees is an all-time quarterback, not because of the team accomplishments, but he did get his hands on one Super Bowl ring, something that Dan Marino didn't, which maybe separates him for some people. He also was damn good in the playoffs. If you look at his career accolades and look at the nuance to some of his career stats, a lot of the reason he didn't win was the defenses that he was a part of. But you could also argue that Sean Payton played a big role in his success, very much like Andy Reid plays a big part in Patrick Mahomes' success, but Mahomes has been able to win more frequently with a great coach, while Drew Brees maybe wasn't able to quite frequently win with a Hall of Fame caliber head coach, which in my opinion, Sean Payton was and is. So when looking at Drew Brees, he played more recently. His individual numbers are up there with the best of them. You look at 11-time yard or touchdown leader, which might be the best that we see in this entire video. I mean, that's just absolutely ludicrous. I mean, 5,000-yard seasons galore, right? 5 all-pro teams, which is pretty impressive, although he never won an MVP, which is certainly something that people will bring up. I think he had seasons where you could argue he was in the discussion. 2009. He had an all-time great season in 2011, along with other great quarterbacks that had all-time seasons in the same season, which was just unfortunate. Even in the year where Mahomes won his first MVP, Drew Brees was the second best MVP candidate for many in 2018. So Drew Brees has had all-time great seasons. It's just a matter of maybe he got a little unlucky with the Super Bowls, a little bit unlucky with the MVPs. But I think you could make one argument for Patrick Mahomes that you can't make for Drew Brees. And that argument is that Patrick Mahomes, at his peak, was without a doubt the best quarterback in the NFL. And while you can make that argument for Dan Marino, I don't think you can make that argument for Drew Brees. I don't think Drew Brees, other than maybe 2009, the year that he won the Super Bowl, was the best quarterback in the NFL. Maybe I'm a hot take here, but because Tom Brady existed, Peyton Manning existed, Drew Brees was not exactly that dude. But looking at where I rank him, I'd say Mahomes is better. I think there is an argument for Marino because what he did in his era was so special. But Drew Brees played in a similar era, if not an offensive happier era, really, when you look at the majority of his career being spent in the 2010s. And Mahomes has had more team success. Mahomes has accomplished MVP trophies that Brees never did. Brees had great coaching throughout the course of his career. Mahomes has had the same, so there's not really an edge there you can give to Brees. There's just very little edges other than the pure amount of stats that Drew Brees brings from a career standpoint. So moving to the next quarterback, we have somebody that I think has a good mix of what Brees brought to the table, what Marino brought to the table, but then also a little bit more of a team success-oriented type of accolades and career resume, along with longevity, and that is the man, the myth, Brett Favre. Brett Favre was an absolute rocket show when it came to throwing the football, and I would argue that Patrick Mahomes is one of the greatest arms we've ever seen. Brett Favre might have had the greatest arm we've ever seen. You watch this man's highlights, you go back to see what he was able to do in his prime, off his back foot, throwing lasers, sidearm, all that stuff. Well, Brett Favre kind of invented that. Brett Favre had a lot of influence over a lot of these quarterbacks in today's age and even before that. And Brett Favre was a gunslinger in a way that he was able to accomplish a lot with a multitude of coaches on a multitude of different teams in a multitude of eras. He was an Iron Man in a way that we don't know Mahomes will ever be or can be. We will see. We will find out. But Patrick Mahomes has 2 more Super Bowl rings than Brett Favre accomplished. Brett Favre does have more MVPs. And in terms of a career, it's hard to argue that Favre has a worse career than Mahomes, even with the rings included, because of the pure mass that Favre carried it throughout his career. So looking at his career, he had 1 Super Bowl, 2 appearances. He did lose to the Broncos and Mike Shanahan and John Elway one season, but does have a Super Bowl ring over my New England Patriots, unfortunately. 199 wins, which is absolutely insane. Like, you just compare that number, 199 wins, to Patrick Mahomes, and you've got 110 more wins. So, that's pretty insane. But Brett Favre has one more MVP. Remember, he was arguably the greatest quarterback we've ever seen in terms of their peak. 3 MVPs in a row is just unheard of, right? 6-time yard and touchdown leader, 6-time All-Pro player. That is more than Mahomes, obviously, by double. So when you look at it, I mean, row for row, Favre is more impressive from a career standpoint than Patrick Mahomes. Physically, he's arguably just as good, right? And I think that's something that we shouldn't forget about Brett Favre. But at the same time, it depends how much do you weigh the ability to be, consistent, which I think Favre at times wasn't the most consistent guy, but of course, that was later in his career. Mahomes has not gotten to that stage yet, so we can't really criticize him for that. And at the same time, Mahomes has accomplished 3 rings, while Favre only ever got to 2 Super Bowls, and Mahomes got to 4 in 6 seasons. So, and Favre didn't have the consistency of an Andy Reid-like head coach, but he did have Mike Holmgren for most of his prime. So, that's not bad. Or he didn't ever have really terrible coaching, I would say, other than maybe a period throughout his Packers careers. But, this one's tough. I would actually argue that this has been the toughest so far. And I would say that Brett Favre is debatable. I think because his career numbers overall are more impressive and just his longevity and all that stuff, I would argue that Favre just has had more of a lens to take a look at. And because of that, I would say that Favre is a debatable. Is he better than Mahomes? Is he not better than Mahomes? I think his career would argue that it's better so far. But I think in terms of their absolute ability to win, Mahomes gets that edge. So it depends on your preference. I would say it's debatable. So that's why I put Brett Favre in that slot. Now, when it comes to winning, there is a quarterback that certainly can argue that they have done more in terms of winning than Patrick Mahomes, even in a short period of time. And that man is Terry Bradshaw. Terry Bradshaw led the way for the 70s Steelers dynasty. And I think honestly is underappreciated by many people that didn't watch him play. Because I think physically he was better than people think. He had a really strong arm. He was able to throw a really wicked deep ball in an era that wasn't all about efficiency and throwing the ball short and throwing the ball for completion percentage and all that garbage. But it was more about high octane, explosive passes, run the football, and then he was really clutch. He was really good in Super Bowls. He was really good in the playoffs. He won a lot of games. He was on a great team. He often had great defenses. He often had great receivers. He often had a great running back. He had a great coach, a Hall of Famer. So Bradshaw got a lot of help, but he was also, I think, a little bit underrated. So looking at what Bradshaw was able to do in his career, 4 Super Bowls and 4 appearances. That sounds similar to Joe Montana. That is more Super Bowl rings and the same amount of appearances as Patrick Mahomes. He still has the edge in terms of overall wins on Mahomes by about 40 plus, and he did win an MVP. So that's only 1 short of Patrick. 2 touchdown/yard leader seasons, and 1 All-Pro team. So I think when it comes to comparing Bradshaw to Patrick Mahomes, I think the one thing that you can say is Bradshaw had more team success so far, but Mahomes was the more accomplished individual player with more yards and touchdown leaders, more All-Pro teams, more MVPs, and overall looked at as the better player. I think that is no argument. Bradshaw certainly had flaws in his game. He was a little bit turnover happy. He was a little bit raw. He was a little bit, to be honest, a little bit dumb. Patrick Mahomes is a smarter quarterback, and certainly Bradshaw had more overall talent around him. So I think for that fact, I would argue that Mahomes certainly clears. Despite Bradshaw winning more Super Bowls, I think that's really the only thing you can say about Bradshaw that he was better at than Mahomes or accomplished more than Mahomes. So doesn't really have much of an argument other than just the fact that he was on a dynasty team. And he wasn't really the reason they were winning. It was mostly due to defense, but Bradshaw was really good. Don't get me wrong. All right. The next quarterback is none other than John Elway, that I think really has a compelling argument against Patrick Mahomes because Physically, you can really make no argument that John Elway was one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. He could run. He was big, strong, powerful, had an amazing arm, could throw the ball from one hash to the other across the field with ease. He really carried a lot of bad football teams, and I think that's probably the most underrated nuance that you could argue for John Elway. He didn't really have great coaches until he got Mike Shanahan and then therefore won 2 Super Bowls. He, in his later years, was able to pick up rings, but he actually was able to go to 5 Super Bowls, and he really dominated the AFC from a winning perspective for a number of years. He played in a tougher era, and he was a quarterback that could really do everything in terms of run, throw. He wasn't the most efficient. He didn't, really worry about interceptions and all that sort of stuff. He turned the ball over. But he often played on a defensive-oriented team that relied on him to single-handedly make plays with his pure ability. Kind of think of a Josh Allen type of player, but just overall more accomplished. That's kind of what John Elway was for the younger folk. When looking at John Elway's career, 2 Super Bowl rings, 5 appearances. So more appearances, but less rings. Most of that had to do with the fact that the NFC was absolutely ridiculous. And oftentimes John Elway would find himself up against just better teams in the Super Bowl and not really any fault of his own. 160 wins, which is still, a lot more than Patrick at this point. 1 MVP season, which is 1 less than Mahomes. 1 yard and touchdown leader, which is probably the thing that hurts Elway the most. Statistically, he's not the most impressive quarterback you've ever seen. And 3 All-Pro teams. So the thing about Elway is he's a rare case where oftentimes a guy with his physical attributes has a lot of stats to back it up. Think of Dan Marino. Think of Brett Favre. Maybe Aaron Rodgers, who we might be discussing shortly. But he was a little bit different. Elway was a physically special quarterback that via the eye test you could tell was amazing. But at the same time, he won a lot. But he didn't have as many rings as Mahomes. So that's an interesting conversation to have. What would you say, right? Physically, okay, about even. But you look at, leading seasons and that sort of stuff, all-pro teams, MVP, Super Bowl rings, those all belong to Patrick Mahomes. So I think when you talk about this one, I would go with John Elway being in the little debate category. I think actually Brett Favre has a better debate because individually, statistically speaking, and MVP-wise, Favre had a more impressive career. And Mahomes has already surpassed Elway in terms of overall Super Bowl championships, although Elway still holds the edge in appearances. But just statistically speaking, Mahomes has been a lot more impressive and overall dominant even in his era than Elway. So that's why I have Elway in the little debate alongside Dan Marino. The next quarterback is none other than Aaron Rodgers, who we've already discussed. And the funny thing about Aaron Rodgers to me is that the same people that are calling Patrick Mahomes the GOAT currently are the people that were calling Aaron Rodgers the GOAT about 5 to 10 years ago, which is fine. I understand that you need ratings on television shows and debate shows, but I just find that to be fascinating that the same people that used the quote-unquote eye test for Aaron Rodgers and nothing else are using the same thing for Patrick Mahomes. Now, I think the argument can be made for Patrick Mahomes that he actually has accomplished more from a team standpoint. He is a winner in comparison to Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers is not a winner. He only has 1 Super Bowl championship and really numerous defeats in big moments where you would argue he should have gotten that done, and he didn't. I think a lot of people just straight up don't like Aaron Rodgers, which is another thing that I think they hold over his head. And I don't think that's really fair. I don't think we should be basing Aaron Rodgers' legacy on the fact if you liked him or not. Maybe he's a little arrogant. Maybe he's a little out there. Maybe he's a little bit into himself. But hey, he's a great quarterback. He was a great player. And I would argue, physically speaking, Aaron Rodgers is a superior player. I think that he was more accurate than Mahomes. I think arm strength-wise, it's pretty even, if not Aaron Rodgers held the edge. I'd argue that Rodgers' pocket presence was better. I'd argue that Aaron Rodgers' ability to not turn the ball over was better. And I'd argue that Aaron Rodgers often had terrible coaches. And I would argue that Mike McCarthy kind of held him down in a key point of his career for a while. And I don't think Mike McCarthy was terrible necessarily, but I think his offense was very simple and didn't necessarily give Aaron Rodgers an edge in any way, shape, or form. I'd also argue that Rodgers didn't have defense for a lot of his career. He did when he won, but not really throughout. So Aaron Rodgers is an intriguing case. Looking at his career, he really individually has a strong case. 4 MVP trophies, which is Mahomes is chasing, right? 2 MVPs for Mahomes compared to 4 for Rodgers, and Rodgers was able to pick up 2 during the prime of his career and 2 later in his career in 2 different incarnations of Aaron Rodgers. He's a 2-time yard and touchdown leader, which I think is honestly kind of disappointing. And I don't even know, looking at this stat, if that's even correct based on what I know about him. All-Pro teams, 5. Still very impressive individual accolade there. And then 159 wins, but again, only 1 Super Bowl appearance and 1 Super Bowl ring, which is disappointing, right? And that's very similar to Drew Brees. I think Drew Brees and Aaron Rodgers is a compelling argument because Brees had better stats. Brees led more categories. Brees was maybe more consistent. Rodgers, though, had more peak performances. Rodgers had more MVPs by 4. Rodgers, was more acclaimed in terms of physical ability. Rodgers more acclaimed in terms of at their best, who was the best quarterback in the league. I think Rodgers at one time had that argument, while Drew Brees really didn't. And the Super Bowl rings are even. So I think most people would put Rodgers above Brees, although there is an argument there to be had. So when looking at Rodgers compared to Mahomes, obviously Mahomes, team-wise, way more successful. Individually, not quite, but I would put Rodgers in the it's debatable category because of the fact that they're both acclaimed for their physical attributes, because they both accomplished a lot individually, but Mahomes had more team success. If you were going to ask me the question, who would I rather have in a 1-game setting, Patrick Mahomes or Aaron Rodgers, I would take Patrick Mahomes. And I wouldn't really worry about that. But if you're talking about, okay, at the peak of their powers, who was like individually a better player? I think there's an argument for Aaron Rodgers. So that's why I put him in the it's debatable category. The next player is a player that's often forgot about because of the era that he played in, but in my opinion is one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever live. And that player is automatic Otto Graham of the Cleveland Browns. Otto Graham is one of the greatest winners in the NFL and in football history, period. And from an individual accolades resume standpoint, has one of the greatest cases to be arguably the greatest quarterback to ever live, maybe only short of one other quarterback. And Otto Graham, when you watch his highlights, I think you could make an argument that it wasn't only because of the era he played in, although that's maybe why his accolades were so amazing, because the competition wasn't that good. His team was so good. His coach was so good. He played in a, revolutionary system, a revolutionary time, and therefore the edges were stronger for certain coaches, certain teams, certain quarterbacks, etc. So that argument can be made in Mahomes' favor. But when you watch Otto Graham play on the film and on the highlights, you would make an argument, at least I would, that Otto Graham probably could have played at any time. So I would also add that in because he was actually a really good athlete and could run and all that stuff. He actually played running back before he played quarterback. So looking at Otto Graham, he had 3 NFL championships, 4 AAFC championships. That's 7 championships in his career. So as a winner, Otto Graham, there's not many that get better than Otto Graham. Now, 66 wins is only per the recorded Pro Football Reference, although he played more time and they just, for whatever reason, didn't have his stats, so I couldn't actually add them up, but 66 wins on the ones that counted. 3 MVPs in the NFL, 2 MVPs in the AAFC. In terms of yards and touchdown leaders, 3 in the NFL, 5 in the AAFC. And the All-Pro teams, 6 for the NFL and 4. So, his entire career, he was basically praised as the greatest quarterback in the game. And from start to finish, he won. He almost never missed the championship game. He almost never lost. He was basically perfect from a resume standpoint. But he played in an era where it was easier to accomplish those feats. And let's be fair, he played with arguably the greatest coach of all time. So that is also to be debated. But when talking about Otto Graham, I have always listed him as a top 5 quarterback of all time. And based on the resume and based on giving my respect to the history of the game, I do have Otto Graham in the it's debatable category. I would slightly lean towards Otto Graham being greater than Patrick Mahomes at this point due to the fact that he has more championships. It's even if you just include NFL championships. When you talk about individual accolades, Otto Graham, more impressive across the board. And he didn't play very long either. So that's something to consider, as well, that he didn't play that long. So it's not like Mahomes' career is that far off here. So I would argue that Graham, in terms of when you elevate the it's debatable category between Rodgers and Favre, he is a little bit ahead of Rodgers and Favre, in my opinion, in my all-time status and rankings because of the accolades. But many people would just rule him out and not even include him because of the era he played in. And I can't really convince those people otherwise. So I'm not going to try. Now, there is a quarterback that they might not include Otto Graham, but they might include Johnny Unitas. Johnny Unitas at one time was praised and pretty much placed as the greatest quarterback to ever live up until Joe Montana, when there became another debate. And I would argue that many people still thought Johnny Unitas was the greatest quarterback ever until Tom Brady. So, Johnny Unitas really was arguably the greatest quarterback of all time, at least arguably is the key word here, from the middle of his career, basically, until 2014. Like, that's a long time. So when looking at Johnny Unitas's accolades, this is why. All right. He had one Super Bowl ring, so he had some crossover with the Super Bowl era, the beginning of the Super Bowl era, and the pre-Super Bowl era, which is the NFL, just period. He played in the NFL, but not the Super Bowl era for the whole career. He had a very impressive balance of he won, but he was more so known as like Peyton Manning before Peyton Manning. He created a lot of the things that the quarterback did in terms of audibles, in terms of, complex passing schemes, timing on routes, on passes. He was extremely accurate. He was the ultimate distributor of the ball. He is not known for his physical ability. A lot like a Peyton Manning, he was a cerebral assassin on the field. And I think, when you look at this resume, I don't think there's much to argue here in terms of, other than physical ability and eye test and era, I don't think there's anything you can argue for Mahomes, honestly, right? Championships, Unitas had 1 in the Super Bowl era, 3 otherwise. Super Bowl appearances or NFL championship appearances, 5 in the Super Bowl, 2 in the Super Bowl, 5 overall, 124 overall wins, 3 MVPs, 8-time yard or touchdown leader, 8-time All-Pro team, accomplished everything you could accomplish, ended his career with every single statistic, influenced the game at a different level, right? Johnny Unitas deserves love from all football fans, no matter what age they are. They should study who Johnny Unitas is and was. That's how impactful he was to the NFL, especially at this position. So when discussing that, I have to have Johnny Unitas as better than Patrick Mahomes. Not because I think Patrick Mahomes was not physically better, could throw the football cooler from more angles, or could run better, but because Johnny Unitas was more accomplished and more influential to the sport. So that's why Johnny Unitas ranks above Patrick Mahomes. Now, one thing I think you could argue just to finish that conversation off, I think there is a small argument for Mahomes in terms of clutch ability. I think Unitas was clutch, but I think what people had to say about Montana over Unitas when they argued that was that Montana was better in the championship game. And maybe if you were to argue Mahomes even now over Unitas, which I think is incorrect, it would be because of that fact. Now let's talk about somebody that was undoubtedly the greatest clutch quarterback of all time. You might know him. His name's Tom Brady. Tom Brady is currently, by many people, argued to be the greatest quarterback of all time. And you guys know my favorite player of all time is Tom Brady. But there are many people that, for whatever reason, choose to disrespect Tom Brady. They think that for whatever reason, which is honestly, are any even like remotely true? I don't think so at this point. I think everything's been proven incorrect. But a part of me still sees this. And it's ridiculous, right? We've got people on ESPN arguing that Patrick Mahomes is better than Tom Brady for no other reason than they like him more, or he throws the ball in a cool style. But when looking at the career accolades, Patrick Mahomes is not better in any single thing, right? Tom Brady has 4 more rings. Tom Brady has 6 more Super Bowl appearances. Tom Brady has 286 wins, which shouldn't even be a real stat. That doesn't even make sense, okay? Guys, Patrick Mahomes has 89 wins. Now imagine how many games Patrick Mahomes has won, and now add 200 to that. 3 MVPs, which is maybe the, like, if you could like look at one single category and say, Tom Brady didn't win. Why did he only win 3 MVPs if the greatest quarterback of all time? I think there's a lot of layers to that. There are seasons that Tom Brady certainly could have won MVP, but he was not given the award. And that is kind of like a we got bored of you type thing. And I think a lot of that is narrative driven. I think the MVP trophy and none other than 2021 proved this correctly to me. This is why I will always hold Super Bowl championships over most valuable player trophies. Because most valuable player trophies are voted on. They aren't awarded. They aren't won. They are voted on. They are narrative. So I could have thought Tom Brady was the greatest quarterback in 2006 or 2005. But because he was throwing to Riche Caldwell and not Marvin Harrison, he didn't win MVP. Or I could argue that Tom Brady had better stats than Matt Ryan in 2016. That PFF graded him as the greatest quarterback in a single season ever. But because he was suspended for some BS, he didn't win MVP. Or I could argue that in 2021, he led the NFL in yards and touchdowns. But for whatever reason, Aaron Rodgers won the MVP. We still don't know why. So there are many seasons you can just go throughout his career where some things just don't add up. But yards and touchdown leaders, 9, which is very impressive. 6 All-Pro teams. I mean, the resume speaks for itself. Tom Brady's better than Patrick Mahomes, right? It's not particularly close from a career standpoint. People are wondering if Mahomes can chase him, can catch him. That's a question for another day. We will find out, right? But when it's all said and done, there's one thing that Tom Brady will always have, and that is beating Patrick Mahomes when it mattered most in his 40s. And that's another thing that Tom Brady will always have over probably most quarterbacks, if not all. He played until he was 45 years old, and he was still pretty good. So, you know, that's pretty impressive in its own right. So when looking at Tom Brady, stop it. Just stop arguing that Patrick Mahomes is the best you've ever seen, the greatest you've ever seen. And the last thing I'll say about that, the reason people argue that is because of Mahomes' ability. A word that is subjective. A word that can't be measured. Ability. Which is the same reason that people argued Rodgers was better than Brady. Ability. The ability to throw. The ability to run. Ability. Now, what I'll say about that is Brady is more accurate than Mahomes. Brady arguably had just as good of an arm as Mahomes. And you can watch the highlights. I mean, these are all out there, especially in his prime. Look at 2007. Look at 2006, 2005, when Brady was at his physical peak, and watch him throw the football, right? Talk about mental ability. Well, I think there's only one other quarterback that compares in that regard. Pocket presence, where you're talking about just the overall ability to play the quarterback position. I think there is a fair argument that other than arm angles, Tom Brady is just as good, if not better, than Patrick Mahomes. So I just want to throw that out there. And mobility, obviously. Because people just take mobility and they think of physical talent. But Michael Vick isn't in this video. So looking at the next quarterback, This one, I think, has a much stronger, closely tied debate, and I wanted to end with two quarterbacks in particular because I think they're the most interesting when debating against Patrick Mahomes. So just a refresher on Patrick Mahomes, right? 3 Super Bowl rings, 4 appearances, 89 wins, 2 MVPs, 3 yards and touchdown leader, 3 all-pro teams. Accounting for every layer within our conversation, Patrick Mahomes will next debate against Joe Montana. Joe Montana, for myself, was the greatest quarterback of all time until about, well, I'm not going to lie, young Mitch thought Tom Brady was the greatest quarterback in 2007. Although that wasn't really proven to be correct factually, objectively, not subjectively. Subjectively, Tom Brady was the greatest quarterback in 2007. Objectively, it was 2014, right? 4 rings, 6 appearances, the MVPs, all that stuff, right? So, when looking at it objectively, is Montana better than Mahomes? Well, let's look at Montana's resume. 4 rings and 4 appearances. So has a slight edge in terms of the rings category. In the same amount of appearances, Montana was special in the Super Bowl. He was just clutch. He was Joe Cool. And this is what I always heard from my dad and his friends. Joe Montana was the king. Joe Montana was God. Joe Montana was that guy in terms of the clutch, just the ice cold. And, nobody could really argue that ever, and you still can't argue that. I think that's why you would argue Montana's probably the second greatest quarterback for many people, other than only Tom Brady, right? Because of that trait. 133 wins, 2 MVPs, 2 touchdown yard leader. He did lead the league a lot in passer rating and completion percentage and stuff like that, but I don't count that stuff. All pro teams, 5. So Montana at one time was the best quarterback in the NFL. Now, I think for Montana, though, there was some argument about Marino, right? I think there was an argument about very much Peyton Brady-esque. Is this a situational thing? Is this a team thing? Is this quarterback better individually, right? I think a lot of people could have looked at that, but I think what you can't take away from Montana is how he performed in the clutch. He never really faltered. And while he did lose, right, he never really faltered. Now, Mahomes so far, he's never really faltered. He's lost a couple times. He's had a couple bad performances, but so did Montana, right, against the Giants and things like that, the Bears. But come on, I mean, it happens eventually to people. I would argue that, yeah, I mean, physically speaking, talent speaking, Mahomes is better than Joe. You even watch them. I don't think Montana has the same argument as Brady in terms of mechanics, intelligence, accuracy. You watch Montana play, and most of him was he got the ball in the right spot on time. He had a little bit of mobility to him. He was pretty accurate, but he wasn't like Brees, Peyton, or Brady. He had a good arm, but I mean, it wasn't John Elway or Dan Marino or Aaron Rodgers or Brett Favre. He was just really good at winning and really clutch and just a ballsy, tough mother you-know-what. And so it's hard to account for that in that conversation. But I would argue that currently Joe Montana is still better than Mahomes. And it's because 4 out of 4. It's because overall, accolades-wise, they're pretty similar. I mean, they have the same amount of MVPs. All pro teams, Montana has more, stuff like that, career accomplishment-wise. But I think that the biggest argument I could make for Montana over Mahomes is their play in the Super Bowl. I think Montana was arguably the greatest Super Bowl quarterback, and the only one that's debatable is Tom Brady. And when it comes to Mahomes, he's not been that great in the Super Bowl. Even the ones that he's won, they've been fairly mid performances for his standards, and overall, statistically speaking, even in this era, they're not that great. So I would say that overall, because of that fact alone, Montana gets the edge. Now, finally, the last quarterback I want to debate is Peyton Manning, who I think, more so than any other quarterback right now, and Tom Brady gets slighted a lot by certain people, but Peyton Manning doesn't even get discussed And honestly, it's disappointing. I need to do a better job highlighting Peyton Manning as somebody that talks about the NFL, because I grew up with Peyton Manning. I very much respect Peyton Manning. I think that there is no other quarterback that I feared on the other side watching play my teams than Peyton Manning, and that includes Patrick Mahomes. So maybe I'm giving away my answer, but Peyton Manning was really special, and I don't think people remember this. Peyton, when he was on and he was at his peak, there was just something about this guy. He was so smart, and he just had a control over the game. He was truly the sheriff. Like, he was just able to control the game. His coaching, I would argue, was not as good as Mahomes. He did it with numerous coaches. He went to Super Bowls with numerous coaches. He won Super Bowls with numerous coaches. He won Super Bowls on numerous teams. He only won 2, which is less than Mahomes, which is the argument that Mahomes has, because all the other categories he doesn't, right? Peyton, arguably, individually speaking, 5 MVPs, 7 touchdown and yard leader seasons, 10 All-Pro teams. Even Brady falters to Peyton Manning's individual accomplishments. And 200 wins is nothing, to sneeze at, all right? But Mahomes was certainly more clutch, and is certainly more clutch. There's no debate. Peyton choked a lot. And you can go through, some of the times he should have accomplished more than he did with certain teams, or he fell short in 2005 or 2007 or 2013. He embarrassed himself in the Super Bowl. But at the same time, and taking a look at this, this is actually 4 Super Bowl appearances. I should fix that. But 4 Super Bowl appearances, 2 rings. Just want to make sure that I got that correct. Peyton was arguably the smartest quarterback of all time. Arguably the most accurate quarterback of all time. Arguably the most, how do I put this? Lacking of system. He didn't need a system. He was the system. He created the system, right? And so that was his argument against Brady, until Brady kind of like smashed that with the whole Belichick narrative, along with going to Tampa Bay. So in terms of that, Peyton Manning is better than Mahomes. But Mahomes can surpass him because of the fact that you always think back to Peyton and you think all the times he fell short. But we still have a long career remaining for Patrick Mahomes. So when going over it, the quarterbacks that I would say Mahomes is better than: Terry Bradshaw, Drew Brees, John Elway, Dan Marino. I didn't include in this video Rodgers, Staubach, Steve Young, those type of guys. I would also put Mahomes ahead of those guys. I just used the most commonly referenced greatest quarterbacks of all time. If you want to include Bart Starr in there, he's better than Bart Starr. It's debatable. Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers, Otto Graham. If I were to take Mahomes in one game versus any of these guys, I'd probably say, yeah, sure. Now, that being said, over a long course of time, I think the career accolades and accomplishments, Otto Graham is better. I think in his era, even more accomplished. But I would argue that Mahomes probably is the better player than Rodgers and Favre, although it's close. But the players that I believe still rank above Patrick Mahomes is Johnny Unitas, Joe Montana, Peyton Manning, and of course, Tom Brady, which he might never surpass Tom Brady. But we'll have that debate one day. Gronk spiked the like button. Thank you guys for watching. This has been the debate. Mahomes versus the greatest of all time. Peace.